Welcome to Myanmar Musings, the research podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre based at the Australian National University, Canberra, where we specialise in interesting, informal interviews with leading scholars and thinkers who have important things to say about Burma. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's October 28, 2016, and today we are speaking with Gerard McCarthy, Doctoral Fellow at the Department of Political and Social Change in the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University, and until recently, a visiting fellow at the University of Yangon's Department of International Relations. Gerard has just conducted 16 months of ethnographic and survey research in Central East Myanmar, focusing on the recent evolution of informal social and political institutions. His research interests include taxation and public goods provision and the notions of moral citizenship animating them, informal social welfare, provincial elites and their contemporary civilianization of power, the internet, cyberspaces and social media activism. Hello, Gerard.
Hello, Mingalava.
Okay, so let's begin with an overview of your PhD. What led you to starting your PhD on Myanmar here at the ANU? What question is your doctoral research trying to answer, and why is it important?
So my background is actually looking at societies that are ethnically and religiously diverse and the ways in which they resolve political and social conflict. And that's how I kind of came to an interest in Myanmar around about 6 or 7 years ago. But I previously worked in South Sudan at the time of the referendum on independence in South Sudan, when the country split in half, as a legacy of the civil war there. And then did my honours dissertation a few years ago looking at decentralisation in Indonesia and the impact that it had on ethno and communal violence. And I grew increasingly interested in Myanmar, especially as things were starting to change. It was clear that the old patterns of the 2000s and 1990s seemed to be changing in some way. And so I wanted to kind of look at a case of a society that was tangibly trying to think about political reform. So, yeah, I mean, that's how I kind of came to an interest on Burma, and ANU was the place in Australia to do that.
You came, so that's a good background for how you came to propose your PhD research. What exactly is it about, and how have you framed it and everything in this, given your background and your interests?
Yeah, so I actually started off with a strong focus on, so I had an interest in media landscapes changing, and especially social media. Around the time of starting my PhD, there was big discussions about the liberalisation of telecommunications in Myanmar. And so I was thinking very deeply about how this was going to tangibly impact the way in which people think about politics, but also how it may also impact the political transition more broadly. And then after starting my PhD and sort of reading more widely within literature about political sociology, about political institutions, I grew increasingly interested just in essentially networks of information, networks of identity, and networks of power. And so ended up kind of stepping back from a strong focus explicitly on social media or just on media, but thinking more broadly about institutions that tie communities together and that tie identities together, and so I've ended up looking at a whole range of, especially informal political institutions is how I think about it, but non-state welfare groups in particular is kind of how I started my research in the field, and that sort of expanded, and I have ended up looking at sort of big aspects of social media particularly, because that's the space now where increasingly a lot of these groups fundraise, they raise awareness about a whole range of issues, but also there's tight linkages between kind of welfare networks and political networks.
Facebook is obviously, and other networks obviously, is one of your field sites, but you did spend a considerable amount of time in Myanmar recently. Could you talk a little bit about the locations where you did your fieldwork? I've never been to that part of the country. I don't know much about it, and I'm sure many of our listeners would like to hear as well.
So I spent 16 months in basically central East Myanmar, just in the northern tip of Bago region, about an hour south of Naypyidaw, and about 4 hours north of Yangon. I arrived there in February 2015, and as I said, sort of started focusing the first wave of my research, just trying to understand who was providing welfare. And I knew that there were these huge number of non-government welfare groups, or what were considered to be non-government and were in the academic literature seemed to be sort of ostensibly apolitical. And so I wanted to kind of understand where did these groups come from, as well as the kind of politico-moral identity that was sort of baked into their work. What was motivating people to actually raise funds, provide assistance to the elderly, provide free funerals, provide, subsidized medical care or free medical care, pharmaceuticals, etc. So that was the first wave of my research, and so a lot of that was just trying to understand in this place that's been under government control basically since 1948, but is ethnically mixed. It's right next to, the township runs to the border with northern Karen state. So there's a sizable proportion, about 20-25% of the population of the township where I focused my research, Taungul, are Karen Christians predominantly. And so I was sort of trying to understand a variety of the different welfare groups, who was the major providers in this context. And then as that kind of unfolded, as I did my field work and built relationships and made friends with people in these networks, that then sort of tied me into a whole series of other kind of networks, and also pulled me into northern Karen state, which was the bordering township in Thanamji, which had essentially active conflict until 2012, and there's a sort of ceasefire that was signed in 2012, but it's still under parts of it, the township under mixed administration, where there's Karen National Union and government administration in those areas. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I had a strong focus on essentially Burma Buddhist welfare groups initially, and then that unfolded into a larger sort of field site that, you follow the thing. And so inevitably I started following a variety of different welfare groups, and that took me into not just Buddhist, but also some Christian groups as well.
Okay, on a more sort of methodological note, did you find it easy inserting yourself into these communities? Were people very friendly and welcoming? Was there resistance, complications in your field work that you might want to expand on?
Yeah, I found that it takes a lot of work to do ethnographic and kind of try and be immersed in a community. Building up networks really comes in waves, and it's funny, you really have to put in the hours, and you have to put in, especially be there at major moments. It's hard, I think, if you're coming in and coming out for short periods into people's lives. They don't necessarily see you as sort of a constant influence, or even someone that they would call of, hey, there's this thing coming. And when you're there all the time, you inevitably, you become that kind of thing of like, we want to, share with him if he's interested in this thing's happening. It's not exactly necessarily what he's interested in, but give him a call and, he'll come along. And so that was one good piece of advice that one of my advisors gave me before I headed out, which was just say yes to everything. Which is really hard to do, because you have to kind of obliterate your locus of control. You just have to sort of literally, there were so many moments where I said, I really don't feel like going to that thing, going out and doing, relief work in another area of the country. One of the welfare groups that I was involved with around the floods in 2015 had mobilized quite substantially local fundraising, but then had also organised a convoy of trucks to basically go down to the Delta and distribute assistance. And so I sort of just followed with them through the whole process. And it meant that there were other aspects and threads of my research that I just essentially suspended for 3 weeks or so, because that was just way more important in terms of the priorities of my friends and my interlocutors. But also it just had to be my major focus, because it was the major focus of the country as well. But it was interesting that through that experience of going down to the area, to Hintada, to the Delta, to the flooded area, and distributing assistance, we slept in monasteries alongside all these a lot of young people, a lot of students, but also some kind of government servants who'd taken leave from departments. You had a group of a whole bus actually, it was about 45 people from Taungul, who then went down to the Delta. And there's nothing quite like intensive bonding in that way to really just transforming relationships, but also you just build this amazing network of people who are like, he's interested in, welfare and, ideas about who should be providing support. Because that was often a major question. I'd be kind of asking people, are you doing this because the government doesn't do it, or do you think this is just your responsibility to provide support to people who are, in a disaster context? And from that network, that was then in August, or sort of July, August of 2015, we then came back to Taungoo, and a lot of that network that I developed became very actively involved in the election. And so it meant that I had this sort of automatic network of trust and connection within the actual local political context. That meant that I could kind of follow with campaigns and go on to interesting campaign events and that sort of stuff, but also get access to internal party meetings sort of stuff. And so it meant that I could kind of already had this network that this idea that these welfare groups were apolitical sort of started to collapse very clearly. And when you follow the networks, that you see that actually there may not necessarily be ostensibly big P political, but there's a strong small P political, you might say, element to a lot of this welfare work.
So what kinds of, were people thinking much about how much the state should provide in the future and how to pay for it and all of those sorts of questions?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that kind of, it came in phases for me because I explicitly focused on non-government welfare groups as the kind of initial focus of my research. A lot of the work that they do is very much evoking a moral identity of assistance for other citizens. So it's thickly framed in a discourse, a very Buddhist discourse of parahita, for example, which is a work for others, work for the benefit of others. And there's a lot of discussions about the need to try and encourage and develop the idea of parahita se, which is having a mind with a focus on the benefiting others. And this is something that is widely seen to have been linked to a couple of major influences during the 1990s, but especially Aung San Suu Kyi, who even just over the weekend met with a bunch of sort of tycoons, including Kin Shui, who was the former chairman of the USDP and a major sort of jade businessman. And she said, paraphrasing here, but what she said, what we need is that we need business people in Myanmar to stop working in their own self-interest, but begin to work for others. I believe it is possible for them to work for others. And it was just this really interesting demonstration of how this kind of moral identity of kind of working for others is sort of this very nebulous idea, but one which through the work of these welfare groups, they interpreted as this idea that we need to alleviate suffering. And because of that focus on these non-government groups and this idea that it's our responsibilities, I began to think, actually, to what degree is my assessment of kind of Burmese political culture and ideas about the state and ideas of the kind of obligations of citizens to care for each other, is it just being kind of determined by the fact that I'm hanging out with non-government welfare groups and that they're just talking about this moral identity all the time? So I kind of wanted to try and understand where that identity came from, but also the degree to which people were engaging with the state and the kind of discourses and ways in which they engage with that. So some of my work around the 1990s has actually seen that a lot of these networks that developed around welfare groups were actually formed around entrepreneurs and merchants who developed and emerged in the 1990s with the sort of fitful transition to a more market-oriented economy that occurred after the collapse of socialism in 88. And at a provincial level, you see this processing of licensing that goes on, where local business people often with some connection to the military commander or the networks in that area gets a license or a contract to run a bottling plant or a rice mill. And as part of that, there's a kind of contracting dimension to that, but there's also a sense of moral licensing as well, that it's in order to do business activities and to accrue wealth, what comes with that is an obligation to be involved. This is quite explicit in the actual relationships and negotiations between business people and the military at a provincial level in the 1990s. So it's your responsibility as business people to be involved in these welfare groups that previously were seen as fairly skeptically during the period of Ne Win, from what we know about some of the research that was done during that period. But there was sort of a liberalisation, you might say, towards these ostensibly apolitical civil society groups at a provincial level. And with that came along the encouragement of business people to be involved in them. And so that got me thinking about, well, actually, this idea of non-government or non-state groups, it's actually maybe a little bit more complicated. And so it's kind of got me to kind of unpack this idea of just sort of explicitly, it's the state has very little responsibility in state and it's all in welfare, and citizens have all the obligation to provide care and public goods. that actually there's a more complicated story there about the co-production of welfare and the co-production of kind of public goods, and that maybe was a major element of what happened in the 1990s, and that's a legacy of that in the contemporary period.
All right, so I recently saw you present on this. So as part of your research and in collaboration with the International Growth Centre, you published a working paper titled Building on What's There, Insights on Social Protection and Public Goods Provision from Central East Myanmar. In the paper, you come to the conclusion that, and I quote, reforming and improving state mechanisms of taxation is essential to cultivating trust in the state as an institution of care and redistribution, and must become a key element in ongoing decentralisation and local governance reforms. Greater commitment to state welfare and public goods provision by the state must be coupled with a willingness to learn from non-state actors in order to improve social protection outcomes and address the ingrained scepticism of the state amongst Myanmar's most vulnerable people. So I guess there's a few really interesting things in there to unpack. What I'd like to start with, though, is the ingrained scepticism and the lack of trust you identify. Where does it come from? And as you see it, is it unique to Myanmar, given your experience in these other locations? And furthermore, is scepticism of the state actually a problem, and why?
There's a whole series of dimensions to that. So, I mean, experientially, people just have had a really bad experience of the state. The state has been extractive, incredibly oppressive for a very long time, especially in ethnic minority areas. The state and the military as an extension of it, and it's referred often in the same way, especially by some of my Korean informants, in the same way as it's just it's the government. It's just, there's no necessarily differentiation between the government and the Burmese military. People have really good reason to be skeptical of the state. There's interesting additional element, though, of a sense of the state as being an immoral actor, though. And it's partly related to what's happened in the past. But it's also partly, and this is what some of the dynamics that we picked up in the survey, was that partly as a consequence, and my argument is that it's a consequence of the way in which government-controlled areas were run in the 1990s, where these off-putting of responsibilities to welfare groups, that there was a strong moral identity within welfare groups. And with that, often a notion of the state as being a failing institution to provide care, but also one that also just doesn't care. And this notion of alleviating suffering became strongly associated with these local welfare groups and religious institutions, and very weakly associated with the state. And it's interesting now as the state is expanding, because you see this dynamic where communities will consciously avoid talking about the government's involvement in local development projects or local road construction. Because there is this idea, and it's very clear, the way in which the rhetorical kind of kabuki theatre that goes on about, if we talk about the government, then the entire notion of this project as being a moral enterprise, of it being something that is work for others, and that is we're doing out of the goodness of our own mind, begins to fall away. And it's partly related to the idea of the state not giving any choice to people. So the idea essential to merit in Burmese, Galmugudo, is this idea of intentionality, that you want to have the choice, you need to have the choice to be able to take an action to provide support to people or to make donations or philanthropic work. And that this is differentiated from the state where you were just forced, it was just your duty, your tawun, nothing but your tawun. The authority has told you you have to give in your money, and you do it purely out of obligation to the authority or just out of coercion. When you see these projects that we found that through the survey that we did, that 70% of people in rural areas and 50% of people in urban areas of the two townships that we looked at described local road construction as self-reliance, go-to, go-ta. We did it ourselves. And then when we went back and did some follow-up work with these projects, some of which I'd already kind of followed before, we actually saw that there was some often state assistance, either through local development funds or through the headman or municipal government. There was often some involvement in the local project. And some very pointed discussions that I had with local ward headmen, for example, was, why don't you talk about the government's involvement? So, well, if we talked about the government's involvement, no one would think that this would be a meritorious activity. And, it's really, this is, again, this kabuki dance where they say the government is not really involved. It's just someone with a good mind, with Saitana, with a kind of compassionate mind in the municipal government who's giving us support. So there's this sort of concreteness of relationality that there's someone in the government who's giving us support, but the government more broadly remains an amoral actor. And one of the arguments that we make in the paper is that the only way that perception can be, or one of the ways that perception can be changed, is if the state begins to be clearer about actually that taxes paid do have some tangible impact, that they don't just go into the pockets of the generalists. That was one of the recurring features of our interviews with people about tax. And that's the way that the mentality has been for so long. And the idea of the state as an extractive institution has been there for so long, that if there is going to be some change in the way in which citizens see the state, and therefore their willingness to engage with the state's schemes around development, not just to receive support from these schemes, but also play a role in accountability. We've seen across the region major issues of corruption in social protection schemes, for example, and at least kind of a perception of corruption. And if you have such a weak social contract where citizens don't, local communities don't engage with these programs in an accountability or oversight, in an oversight function, then these programs are going to be less effective. So that's why it matters, because it's both broadly important for the idea of some kind of democratic social contract, but concretely, it's really important for accountability and oversight of these schemes.
So a key theme in the report is that the government can learn from non-state actors. What can they learn from the non-state actors, and why should they?
So there were a few. So I was just in Myanmar a few weeks ago, doing some workshops actually with government servants and with bureaucrats in Bago region and Karen State. And some of these ideas that we had sort of came from these. We sort of floated a few ideas, and a few ideas that were thrown up by kind of parliamentarians and bureaucrats. But one of the really clear things was that there needs to be a much clearer demonstration of directness, and that this is a major focus of donations and donation campaigns, that when money is raised from someone, there is an explicit project or outcome that donation is going to go to. If you pay tax, no matter what the tax is, there should be a focus on where it actually goes. So a good example is, or a good counterexample, not an exemplar, is a new campaign that the Internal Revenue Department has launched in Myanmar, which has a kind of anthropomorphized a happy flag of Myanmar. It has its thumbs up and big happy eyes, and it says in Burmese, "It's the duty of every citizen to pay tax levied according to the law." It echoes really thickly of the old slork SPTC propaganda, but it also, just the actual visual of it does. But the actual rhetoric of it doesn't tell you anything about where tax is going. It doesn't tell you anything about the beneficiaries or the outcome associated with engagement with the state. And that's an area where, especially when we were talking to parliamentarians and with bureaucrats, that there was a strong focus that actually, if we're going to do advertising, we should show who's the beneficiary, who's the outcome, in the same way that we do with donations. This is one other idea that a lot of our workshop participants had, of actually showing that there's some recognition associated with tax and paying tax, and that might start to budge through both recognition but also directness, that it goes tangibly somewhere, and also the enlistment of some of these groups into an accountability and oversight position. That may start to budge the perception that paying tax is not meritorious. At the moment, this is a question we asked in a survey, and we found that the vast majority of people say that tax does not draw merit. Gamo kuto mayabu. And this was a really strong and consistent perception that contrasted really strongly with donations.
It's interesting. or you did have, there must have been some Christian Koreans that you were working with and things like this. Everything seems to be coming from a very Buddhist worldview.
And that is the majority of where those groups are the majority where I've done my research, and then we've also did some work, especially around the survey in Northern Korean state, and followed some of those groups. But it is one of the interesting contrasts between Daenjeon and Taungul is that this is partly that draws to this larger argument about the 1990s and legacy of the 1990s, that Daenjeon was not under government administration in the 1990s. It wasn't really under, it's still under mixed administration, and only until 2012, only from 2012 has there been some sort of expansion of government apparatus in Daenjeon. It's interesting that you see the forms of charitable work and the form of especially funeral groups, as well as charitable groups not linked to religious institutions, are much less common in Daenjeon. And especially local road construction projects, much less common for people to be donating funds to these projects. Partly because, as a legacy of the conflict, the KNU discouraged road construction. But there is a really strong role for churches in Christian communities that are playing, in many ways, very similar roles to monasteries. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to compare these quite different places, to actually look at some of the similarities in who's providing support. And in both contexts across the two townships where we did this research, we found that non-government groups, especially religious organisations and welfare groups linked to religious institutions, were across a whole range of different areas: disability care, aged care, assistance in the context of natural disasters, for example, that the bulk of that assistance came from religious institutions, not from the state. And so that is a really clear similarity that we see, even though there are different mechanisms, especially in regards to road construction and sort of charitable, what some of the charitable groups actually look like.
That's good. It also kind of raises interesting questions in my mind about secularism and the future of secularism and the strength of the state. But why don't we go back to something that I sort of touched on before, which is that the this paper that you did with the Growth Centre, to my view, seems to have a fairly strong ideological bias towards the redistribution of wealth. And I wonder, you just did these talks in Myanmar. How is that received in government? Is that
redistribution wealth in what sense?
In the sense that is it universally, is there a strong welfare state universally desired by people in government who you talk to, or are there debates within these circles about the role of the state in welfare and the redistribution of wealth?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's something that the welfare states develop in very different ways, right? And it's interesting. Some of the literature I found really useful to be reading at the moment is stuff on the development of the American welfare state, which is referred to as sort of a welfare laggard. And especially whereas the kind of welfare state developed in Europe, much of Europe, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it wasn't until basically the early 1930s that America starts to roll out some sort of social welfare, Social Protection Act, after the Great Depression, basically. And it's interesting to view the parallels, because up until that point in the 1930s, where even in the way in which the American welfare state developed had a very particular form of kind of co-contribution that people would have to pay in themselves. But between sort of the early 20th century through the 1930s, the dominant ideology was welfare capitalism in the US. And this is something that I see some really interesting and strong parallels, where there was a commercial class that developed, especially Herbert Hoover, encouraged this ideology, which strangely enough, he has a connection to the Burma Company in Burma during the colonial period. And he developed and propagated this ideology of welfare capitalism, where basically businesses would take responsibility for the welfare of their employees. And it's really interesting, and it's hard not to see some kind of parallels to the way in which the political class, but also more broadly kind of welfare provision in Myanmar is conceived as being predominantly the sphere of the private sector, or the private sector in inverted commas, because it is, as I've kind of talked about previously, in many ways has developed as a result of the legacies of the 1990s. but that it is really strongly linked to this idea that generosity and the moral identity of generosity associated with kind of business and donations that's the domain of welfare. That's who should be responsible, or at least that there should be some co-production, that it's important for the community along with welfare groups and local business people to be providing a part of the welfare net, and that even amongst policymakers at a relatively high level, and even MPs within the NLD, for example, will talk about that we can't, the state, it's not the state's responsibility to provide care for the elderly. We can support them through clinics, but there's a degree of skepticism about large-scale direct cash transfers, for example, and which is the major sort of mechanism through which a lot of the international NGOs and international organisations like the World Bank are focusing really heavily about direct cash transfers. So it's interesting. There is a strong sense that in many areas of welfare that it's actually not the responsibility of the state to provide everything, that it needs to be co-produced. And that's something that we found in our survey as well, that when we ask people, is it more important to have assistance from neighbours, compassionate neighbours and family, or is it more important to get support from a government that provides assistance, that the majority of people said both, but only 10% of people said the government was more important. And there's a strong sense that actually it's both the moral responsibility of local communities, especially religious institutions, to provide care and welfare at a local level, and that the state, it would be great if the state supported us. That's the way in which a lot of the NLD-linked welfare groups refer to it. It would be great after the election if the state just simply gives us some more support. There's not an idea that the welfare state will expand into some grand sort of high modernist, Scandinavian-style kind of welfare state.
Fantastic. Look, that's really, really interesting. We've run out of time, as we always do. So before we go, can I just quickly ask, have you been reading anything interesting, seen any films, listened to any cool Burmese music, anything related to Myanmar that you want to recommend to listeners?
So there's 2 great new books, which are edited volumes, which deal in a variety of different ways with sort of legacies of the 1990s and their contemporary sort of implications and ramifications. One is Mandy Sedan's new edited book, which is called War and Peace in the Borderlands of Myanmar, which has a strong focus on the Kachin, because that's what her research works on. But it also has a much larger focus on in some ways trying to tell the stories of sort of ceasefire capitalism through some new angles, the contemporary legacies of ceasefire capitalism, of the KIA being kind of radicalized as a result of the not addressing the political grievances of Kachin people during the ceasefires in the 1990s. That's actually laid the foundations for contemporary the contemporary radicalization of the Kachin and how far the distance between the government now and the KIA. There's also another really good book by Suan Oh from ICS, edited by Suan Oh, called Myanmar's Mountain and Maritime Borderscapes, which has just been released, which also just gives a really a broad sort of, it looks at, literally looks at naval and ocean dynamics, as well as questions of administration and governance in ceasefire areas and in government-controlled areas. And there's a chapter in there by Nick Farrelly as well that looks at kind of the electoral results around the border areas. So it's a very rich book. And there are 2 really good books that deal with borderland issues, but also tell us a lot about where Myanmar has been and where Myanmar is kind of going, the kind of political and social institutions.
They sound fantastic. Especially, I haven't read very much about oceans in Myanmar. It's definitely an under-researched topic. I look forward to checking that out. Thank you so much, Gerard. Really appreciate having you here, and all the best. You've got your midterm seminar coming up soon?
Post the work on November 30th.
November 30th. It's going to be awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.